Hello, animators and artists, and welcome to the Animation Trends event. Marvel's Hit Monkey series is based on the comic of the same name. It's an action-packed, sometimes comedic adult series created by Will Speck and Josh Gordon, with animation by Floyd County Productions. We invited the crew behind Hit Monkey at Floyd County to discuss the craft that went into their project from storyboards to production. So, Jared, Kevin, Brandon, welcome to the stream.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you
Good
for
to be
having
here.
us.
So, can we do a quick start by introducing yourselves and describing your roles on Hit Monkey?
Who goes first?
All right, I'll do it. Kevin Mellon, and I was on season 1. I art directed and also helped oversee the storyboards team.
I'm Jared Hickman. I am the animation director.
And I'm Brandon Berger. I'm the animation technical director in charge of like the rigs and the setup.
All right, so Brandon, what does an average day, like a typical day, look like for you on production?
Once we kind of get rolling, a lot of it is just kind of fixing problems as we go. But usually in the pre-production stage, there's a lot of trial and error and R&D, working with design to kind of see what animation wants to do with the characters and how to best kind of create a rig setup that kind of facilitates that, so that to make the animators' jobs easier, so that they can kind of achieve the performances that they're looking for. So a lot of playing around with rigs and moving things and testing
And whack-a-mole.
Yeah, a lot of whack-a-mole.
Problem.
And Kevin, what does a typical day look like for you and your role?
Season 1, it was all over the place because we were developing the show. So it started out with, doing the pitch pilot and helping to develop that from a boards, and then also from a, helping out on a design standpoint, and then actually starting the show and going rounds and rounds on basically everything from what Monkey looks like to Bryce to what the environments are going to look like, and then working with not only the show creators but with our producers and then our directors like Jared throughout, and Brandon about throughout the whole making of the whole season of the show. And as art director, it was overseeing character design, backgrounds, storyboards. My thing with animation was more kind of like helping Jared note things, helping the producers note things, and stuff like that. So a typical day kind of varied throughout the stages of production, and at most, during the middle of it all, we're working on all 10 episodes at once, and everything is on fire. And it's just a lot of noting, a lot of redlining, a lot of like wearing the different, like switching the different hats. Be like, okay, spending the next hour on backgrounds. Then, okay, I got this animatic that I got to look at, and then, okay, I got to review these designs. So every day was constantly moving and always something different going on. So.
And Jared, how was the how do you describe your average day on production?
Yeah, it really varies, and it gets very complicated because, at the most basic, I'm working directly with the animation team, doing drawovers, helping them with timing charts and giving performance direction, communicating with anyone who also kind of makes creative decisions about story to make sure that our tone feels right, because every single shot builds up to, the tone of the show that you're watching or the scene or whatever, and every little detail kind of is a little piece of the puzzle that makes the show what it is. So I'm helping craft the performances and then planning, these big action scenes and set pieces, working with 3D departments, but you're really juggling a lot of different things, both technical and more creative storytelling stuff, and making sure that I'm not making a decision that makes no sense with with the sort of creative direction of Josh and Will, or our supervising director, Neil Holman, like really, making sure that all of our visions are sort of like coalescing.
So there are a lot of really iconic Marvel characters. There's like Spider-Man and Thor and Doctor Strange, and then there's Hitmonkey. So how familiar were you with Hitmonkey before you joined this project, and what kind of research did you do when you joined the team? And we'll start with you, Jared.
Oh no. It's like I wish you'd start with Kevin. I didn't have I read a lot of comic books, but really wasn't super familiar with Hitmonkey, so it wasn't until I was brought onto the show that I read Hitmonkey. So I mean, it really started there, but also by the time I came on, we had some really strong scripts to work with, and I'd already kind of was able to see like, okay, here's the source material and here's what we're extrapolating from that, and the sort of world we were kind of pulling out of what was already there. And there was still at that point a million more creative decisions to make. But yeah, I really wasn't familiar. So I kind of like became, I came in pretty fresh and was really part of that. Was really taken along the journey as we crafted the first season.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, it's not the most well-known character in Marvel's backlog. On the other hand, it's a really cool high-concept character, right? It's a monkey who's an assassin.
Yeah.
When
The
his
concept
conscience-
stands out really quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and the nice thing about it is his conscience is guided by his own moral quandary of the decisions that he makes that we see in the first episode, and that leads him throughout the whole season, but also of this guy that he's now bound to, Bryce, and them both finding themselves in a similar thing of like having made some bad choices that got them into a bad place and then having to work their way out. And they both have very differing opinions sometimes about how that goes, and that was a lot of the fun of their dynamic and the arc of their arc of that season 1.
Yeah, Brandon, when did you decide to be on this project, and what did that process look like for you, onboarding?
When I came on, everything was kind of already in motion. I forget which episode it was, but I moved over and started kind of helping figure out more of the re-ingestion of files from the outside studios, like how to kind of get them back in to go into like a retakes process. There was a lot of like technical aspect there for like just how different studios worked and how it would be compatible with the way that we set up scenes and what we needed for our comp team. So it was just kind of a lot of I think Jared mentioned earlier, whack-a-mole, just kind of just figuring out, like seeing which problems kind of arose as we brought that stuff back in, and just shot by shot, episode by episode, solving issues. I think it was about halfway through season 1, though.
Yeah, we don't composite Hitmonkey in Harmony directly. Our compositing team works in Blackmagic Fusion, so there's a whole there's a lot to solve when you're exporting like infinitely scalable layers out of Harmony, and then having another department take those, and it was a lot more complicated, but also yielded really awesome results than like how we used to do things back when we would just like shoot it out of Flash and bring it into After Effects.
Yeah, I learned a lot about how the Harmony process works by watching it go through the comp process and seeing how, being able, like, because one of the things that saved as AD, one of the things that saved my butt so many times was the fact that Harmony could give me something at such an insanely high res, and then we get it to comp, and we're able to do something that that previously on other productions we weren't able to do. So,
yeah, adding lots of camera lens distortion and all kinds of crazy stuff, and yeah, I mean, there's so much depth you see in the final show that like was not in there when we animated it. Like it was definitely there's layers and layers and layers of motion.
Yeah.
So, Kevin, since you were involved in the production a little bit earlier, how familiar were you with Hitmonkey before you joined, and what kind of research did you do when developing the show?
Sure. I come from a comics background and read a lot of comics, having made them and also buying a bunch of them, as you can see. So I was aware of the character. I don't think I'd read anything other than a couple appearances, I think maybe in Deadpool comics. So I had not actually read the trade of stuff that exists. So that was a lot of the initial research was once it came to us and we were doing kind of like, pitching and getting that together, was looking at what I found interesting in the character and what I kind of related to. And fortunately, the show creators, Will Speck and Josh Gordon, their pitch to us was a pitch that I loved, and their idea of what they wanted to do with the character, which really draws in like kind of that first little issue and a half of the trade, of that taking that emotional arc and that setup really kind of grounded me towards where we were going, and I really liked the idea of that. And as a comics fan, I obviously love the idea of being able to contribute to the Marvel universe in a minor way. Like it's like we're all kind of, we can all say that we've contributed to this canon a little bit.
So, Kevin, I have another question for you, but I think before I ask it, I know you have a clip. It's a comparison
Sure.
of an animatic and the final production.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I should have learned all the mouth sounds to do the soundtrack.
So all this plays, I'll ask you, Kevin, how did you approach visual storytelling on the series, and what kinds of films were you inspired by?
Well, I approached it because one of the earlier references that the show creators talked about was stuff that lines up with where I come from, anyways, which was that I like, which is a lot of Tarantino, a lot of like 80s, 70s and 80s Japanese crime films. And then a lot of, Scorsese being a big one that was talked about throughout the first couple episodes of like what kind of style of camera, what kind of style of shot. And it's animation, so it's not going to look like Goodfellas, but that feel of like trying to get those kind of camera moves in there, get those kind of blocking and framing. And then a lot of it was just going off of the stuff that we talked about, which was not making it, I worked on Archer for a decade. I love Archer, but not making it look like Archer, not making it feel like Archer, showing people what we as Floyd County can do in another style, which we did with America, the motion picture that I believe Brandon and both Jared worked on. And then this was just another thing that we could go, this is another voice that we have. And so we really kind of pushed those West meets East, anime influences, but also with our Western sensibility of what we love about all of those things mashed together. So,
Jared, I wanted to ask, so with that in mind, like, how did that impact the animation process?
Well, I was thinking, I can say that Jared and I had a lot of conversations about what the intent of some of this stuff was, and there was a lot of reference gathering on both sides. And like I was actually just looking at your reference folder the other day for something to try and remember something that we talked about 2.5 years ago. So I mean, it was definitely as much as he may struggle to answer right now, it definitely was something we talked about and we considered. And
Yeah, so it really depended on the scene and the shot, but we pulled probably equally from like the work of like Shinichiro Watanabe, like Cowboy Bebop, and like his kind of style, and like live action. Like, I mean,
a lot of Roger Deakins.
Yeah, we love Deakins. Yeah, and especially Deakins and Coen brothers together.
Yes.
So like, especially for our shot reverse shots, like we're always kind of looking like, how can we sell like a less, I think in animation there's a tendency to use like kind of really over the top physical comedy, and we were really getting this direction where it's like, no, we want it to feel more, less telegraphed, like more
Naturalistic.
yeah, totally. Yeah, so we were always kind of thinking about like what reference points we could pull from, because if you want something to be really believable and natural, you need to look somewhere. It's not going to come straight out of your brain, right? So you need to kind of like, I know for some of the characters, we would like kind of obsessively watch like certain like ticks of like actors whenever they went a close up, if their eye twitched or something like that. And so we tried to find more ways that I think are maybe more techniques that are probably really common in 3D animation, like, anytime you're in a close up, like characters' eyes not really staying still ever, and moving very subtly. That was a lot of stuff that we pulled more from like live action reference.
Yeah, when we were setting up like the pilot and the pitch pilot and stuff like that, like one of the things that I went to the producers with early on was I was like, this needs to be widescreen. So it was pitching people on the 19 on that 2.24 aspect ratio. The other thing that I kind of landed on, and this may have been a group thing, but I remember us like early on having conversations about like the camera's always moving, and that doesn't mean big moves, but it's just the camera's always just, if you're on a single of someone in close up, it's just subtly drifting always, and that's something that if we didn't do it in boards, then we got it put in comp and stuff like that. So
yeah, and people don't think about the challenge of that. A lot of times it's like you don't even notice it, but like it's really, if the camera's always moving, you're always tracking which direction it's moving in. Yeah. And so you really have to think about like not just where the character is in space, but like you really have to think like, what is our A point and our B point, and then like track all these bits in between. I mean, you can patch it up, and I think our compositing department really ended up being that final like cinematography pass.
Very much so, because like the thing that we constantly found ourselves getting into, not trouble, but just like, oh crap, we need to think about this, is not having characters animated enough outside of our aspect ratio, so that way the camera could move, or that the background was, backgrounds were painted huge anyway, so that, but making sure we had enough background to do these pans, to punch in, to do that kind of stuff, and that affects harmony deeply. So.
Totally. We were definitely like going in and patching some extra shirt here and there.
With that in mind, Brandon, what sort of challenges did you run into on the pipeline side because of this very like interesting and ambitious use of like camera movements throughout every single shot?
Well, especially because of the different ways that people worked. Whenever things would come back in, if things didn't stretch out as far, whenever you would go back into the characters and rigs, it sometimes wasn't just as easy as drawing in what you needed. There would be a bunch of like layers upon layers of things that you kind of had to sift through to be able to add to that artwork. And then being able to then break that up to kick out for composite as well, so that they can do a lighting pass. Every time that there was a change inside of Harmony like that, once we got a shot back, kind of presented like its own list of issues and stuff to have to kind of relayer and re-kick out elements.
Brandon, can we talk a little bit about the rig? So what was the approach to cutout animation in terms of the tools that provided to the animators for the show?
Well, the way that we like to work is we kind of have, especially for an action show like this, we would have a little bit more of a simplified version of the rig. Like everything is kind of broken out and pegged so that it can move, but we try not to over-engineer it so that it's flexible. If people need to do a lot of redraws for any of the action shots, they're not having to fight with 20 or 30 different drawing modules and stuff to make sure everything works. They can kind of have it stripped down to just the bigger elements that they need. But also in training our artists that if they do need that kind of separation, how to adjust the rigs and build upon it themselves, either with deformers or using new drawing modules and sublayers to kind of break it apart. If it was anything really complicated, they could always send it back for the builds team to kind of go through and kind of work on it. But we tried to come up with a good middle ground base that covered a large range of starting somewhere and giving the flexibility to build upon.
And Kevin, what was your approach to planning action scenes, and how did the studios, how do you take the animation process into account for those scenes?
It was definitely a learning process of because with doing something that is so action heavy, it was definitely a lot of like, okay, what can we do? And then some of it was like, let's try it. And then another stuff, it was like getting it into the animatic and, having people like Jared, having our supervising director and producers look at it and be like, we're not sending this out of house. Like, we don't want to do this, A good example of that is in 109, season 1, episode 9, there was scripted and boarded an entire monkey ninja squad fight scene that we were like, we don't have the time or the budget for this. And fortunately, Jared and one of our other animators, Jason Barnes, really kind of like had a notion, and Jared, you can speak to this, but they had this notion of kind of how to handle it via this very graphic, Saul Bass inspired sequence that looks really rad, and B saved us a ton of headache. And while those boards were good, they'll never be as cool as that sequence. And so there was at 107 with the Lady Bullseye chase, that's very choreographed, very set up, and talked about at every stage. Every shot is dissected from a directing standpoint between all the departments involved, especially with 3D harmony, having to work together in tandem to make sure that the harmony is working with the even just something as simple as the right version of the 3D file, or not file but movie, that sort of thing. Like, oh wait, we updated this, like that little stuff, to things like that, getting that 109 sequence boarded out and deciding, like, through producers and directors being like, okay, we're going to toss this. Let's see what else we can do that is simpler to do. So it kind of ran the gamut of like being hyper planned and then going over like, okay, what are we keeping in house? What are we sending out? If we're sending it out, are we confident in what we're giving these people to do the best job that they can do? Like a good example is the scene in 103 in the casino. There's a shot in the back room where Monkey like climbs across the wall, like, and as he's being shot, and it's this crazy fisheye. The board artist pitched that, and I was like, oh man, they're probably going to say no. And it made it through at every stage. But it's one of those things where like he pitched it. It was a cool idea. Like, it looked rad, and everybody fell in love with it that they wanted to see it get through the rest of production. So, it's like, you pick your battles, and also a lot of times, like, when something is that cool, people want it to survive, and so they do everybody kind of does their best to shepherd it through the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if it gives you the payoff that you kind of are looking for in the story. Yeah, I love that we had to cut those corners with that 109 scene, because it makes the joke, it changes the joke, because Price's line is, oh, this is where they put the budget. And then it was supposed to be this expensive fight scene, and it makes it so much funnier. But I think we boarded that sequence. We had to start from scratch because we were completely stylizing it, and I pulled up The Adventures of Prince Ahmed for like style reference of this, like, sort of like thinking of it as these backlit cutout shapes essentially. And we were looking at like Tokyo Drifter and stuff, like the scene in Tokyo Drifter where he's got the backlight behind him that I think Tarantino has referenced in Kill Bill at some point. And I think we boarded it in 2 days or a day.
You guys knocked it out pretty quickly. Yeah.
And then we animated it, and the rest of it was like 3 animators, and one of those animators was the board artist, and then we did it in a week. Yeah. The compositing, I think, probably didn't take too long either. So yeah, it was like, it was definitely the fastest I've ever created that much animation, and it's because we stripped all the detail out. It's just really, really messy, you know, expressive drawings that we didn't do a cleanup pass on. We were just like scratching these silhouettes into
It's
harmony.
definitely I think, you know, I mean, Jared, you play music, you know this, but also like from an art standpoint, there's always, you fall in love with your rough draft. Like you get demoitis, you fall in love with the demo, or you fall in love with the pencil sketch. And I will say that like we did have conversations, if I recall correctly, we had conversations about cleaning it up, but everybody loved like a lot of what was going on. So it was more like clean up the parts that need it and not the whole thing. Like don't polish it if it doesn't.
We definitely assumed there would be a cleanup pass, but we also didn't really have time. And we were like, this is so like weird and expressive. And
kind of keeps that energy better.
Yeah. It was cool.
The only weird factoid about that is at one point we needed to have drawings of the characters slide in, and they didn't want. They just so that landed on me. So it's just okay. Those are my drawings, just sliding in of all the
It was like Photoshop stills.
Yeah.
Those were not drawn in harmony.
Yeah, which that's, I mean, as part of being AD is like a lot of little weird stuff like that. Is it's like I touch everything but nothing at the same time. So when weird little stuff like that happens, it's always like, oh, okay, all right.
Your actual drawing made it through. That's cool.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
Jared, a big part of this show hinges on the relationship between Monkey and Bryce. So how did you approach conveying emotion for these characters, one of which is not a human being and does not emote like a human being?
Yeah, it's interesting. Honestly, like most of the time, if you've ever done therapy, you sort of like learn to talk to yourself like you're talking to yourself as a child. And in a lot of ways, I think of Monkey as like Bryce trying to do therapy. And Monkey sort of becomes this proxy for him. So, there are times where he's really mean to that child, because we're not always kind to ourselves. And there are times where that inner child looks really broken, and Bryce feels responsible for that. And even if he doesn't in that particular case, he still, can break through his ego and sort of, I have a cat happening. So yeah, we were, I think you could think of their dynamic in a lot of different ways, but that always sort of helped me make decisions, rather than like him being his monkey baby or something. I don't know. I think of it less as a parent-child thing and more of like, okay, sometimes they're like, I think Bryce wants to think of them like they're hit partners and Monkey is his sidekick, but really Bryce is sort of, he's working through his own issues in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Jared, what's the name of your cat?
This is Cranberry. She gets on every call. She sits in her little bed, and then she hears me talking to people, and she's like, give me attention.
Yeah, I mean, this is the authentic Floyd County Productions experience.
Yeah. It is. This is literally what ours is like.
This is premium content.
And he's not the only one. There's a lot of cattails just going through a lot of shots. Just
Brandon, from your point of view, what sort of work went into helping animators convey emotion for both Bryce and the non-human characters like Monkey?
I think a lot of facial acting, especially in Monkey, with him being so nonverbal, there was a lot that had to kind of be conveyed in his eyes, and with like different lighting and different like detail stuff to kind of help bring out that character. I mean, language barrier aside, there's like a whole, different dynamic between the two, and like nobody can hear Bryce, so Monkey kind of has to be in the middle of other conversations too. So he has to do a lot of like miming and a lot of stuff that kind of bridges that gap. So yeah, I think just a lot of eye stuff, a lot of stuff in Monkey's face.
Micro expressions.
Yeah, that's the word.
Yeah. It's hard it really is hard to articulate even to animators. Like, no, really barely move the face. When I say just barely move it, I mean like
it still registers. Like whenever you're watching
Exactly.
it, you can still see it, even if it's moving just a few pixels at a time. So it's
Yeah. If I was getting too much, I would be like, I don't want to see it. I want to feel it. You know. But yeah, it's totally challenging.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like when they think of production like Hitmonkey, they think of characters flipping around and fighting, but it's really subtle action, subtle scenes that carry a show. So, Kevin, how did you think about how these characters could convey emotion in your role?
Very much the same thing, just eyes and subtle movements. A great example of that is um, episode 8, where Monkey goes back to his home and discovers that a new tribe has moved in, and it's a lot of this, yeah, there's subtitles on the screen, but there's also just a lot of like subtle gestures, and a lot of that was talked about in boards and then gone over again, especially in animation and stuff like that. But it all came down to just those, like, what are the poses, what are the subtle things that we can do to convey all this. And it was something that we really had to work on as a process to not overboard it, in the sense of to not go big moves. It's like only go big moves when you really need to, like those action scenes, or if somebody is like really doing something. But it's a lot of normal, and we talked about this earlier, but those naturalistic gestures, and really getting people to focus on, like, how, when you talk to someone, what are you doing? Like, I'm a hand gesture guy when I talk, but I'm not doing this whole conversation. You know what I mean? It's very getting that to feel natural, but also getting, people like Monkey, getting people like Bryce to really drilling down and having those conversations, and especially just talking with the people, which became more difficult because production moved to work from home in the middle of, when COVID happened. But having these conversations where we say, pointing is not acting. Subtlety is sometimes what Jared said, moving things a couple pixels, and that does it. Because also you got to realize most people like who are reviewing this stuff, they might be watching it on their phone, but phones are so good, like they're gonna see every little subtle thing. But also, there's enough people watching it on 60-inch television. It needs to work at both levels, And then there was a lot of conversation about like that kind of thing, and then just really just reminding ourselves, just over and over again, like internally, like subtle, dial down, like don't get too broad, especially in boards. It's very easy to make boards a little bit more, for lack of a better term, cartoony. And I know that sounds weird, but to get overly broad. And that was a constant thing that we were battling and really kind of working on that whole season.
A lot of storyboarders have to have their shorthand because they have to work quickly, and so they have these shorthand poses. They're like, I know how to draw this real quick.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to rip those out. And
I mean, yeah, an easy example. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, easy example is like, boarding on Archer for so many seasons. There's what became known as the WTF hands, because it's like when you're having people in Archer and they do this a lot. So you're talking and do this, and it's literally to indicate emotion or acting, but it's such a shorthand. And I spent a lot of time, because I'm so hyper aware of it from having done it, I spent a lot of time like beating that out of people, being like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Even if they hadn't worked on Archer, they still picked up that it was a visual language thing that could get them a lot of mileage in a lot of scenes. But we prefer not to send that to animators, because then they're sitting, not only it puts them in a possibly lovely position of having to make decisions, but it puts them in the precious position of like, oh God, okay, I need to really drill into the essence of the scene here, both good and bad. And we want to give them as much information as possible that is heading them in a right direction. And, like that.
And I think animation has the benefit of the movement too, whereas board, since there's so much static, like pose to pose and stuff, that it sometimes can feel dead if you don't have those big gestures. So I think some of the acting choices get kind of called out that way.
Yeah, very much so.
And we rip them out.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and we understand that.
Hitmonkey is a series that like features real locations and real animals. So what kind of references did your team rely on while working on this series?
For animals specifically, we have an animal expert. One of our lead animators, Victoria, was kind of like always our our sort of like front end animal research person, because if she hadn't already animated that specific animal, she was really good at digging in and figuring out like what makes what makes a capybara different from a rat or something, like in how they move. So it was really great to have her helping us guide those decisions. So like a lot of animators would draw, whenever Monkey was on all fours, they would draw him walking on his knuckles, and macaques don't walk on their knuckles, they walk on their hands like this. And so she was the first person to point that out, and I totally didn't even notice. I was like, oh, they don't? Okay.
And it was something we struggled with in boards too, was getting people to do that. And now, like, also Monkey at a certain point doesn't walk on his all fours that much, so it's like he's more but we had to have those conversations of like, well, he doesn't walk like a human either.
Yeah, he kind of waddles a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
He's a little bit bow-legged.
Yeah, on the pre-production side, it was just a ton of just. Fortunately, there's a lot of videos of people going to those pools and watching macaques and seeing how they interact with people, watching them very funnily steal people's phones while they're trying to take pictures of them, stuff like that. The beauty of the internet is just having all of that information at your resource, and just oversharing it with people and making sure that people really kind of understood what we were going for.
Mm-hmm.
And
for humans, animals, it's easier. We shoot a lot of reference for humans, so
yeah. And for animals specifically, whenever you get to builds too, you have to think of them different. There's different bone structure and a lot of different things that have to be set up to move in ways that you can't just build the same rig that you would for a human.
Right. So a macaque monkey is not a tiny person with a tail.
Not quite.
Right.
May seem that way sometimes, but we're not trying to make it that way.
Well, with that in mind, Jared and Brandon, I want to know a bit more. What was the approach to like rigging and animating these characters in Harmony?
It was a lot of fudging around and finding out. I don't know if I can swear. Like there was a lot of experimentation. I think at the time on a previous production, we had kind of pushed our own limits in terms of like how complicated and fleshed out our rigs could get with fully sort of auto-tunable master controller characters. And Brandon was like, the driving force behind that, really. Him and his team over there. But at the time when we were starting that season, we didn't have Brandon on, and we kind of had to just move, and we didn't actually have that much startup time for R&D for rigs. So we opted to start as simple as possible, and then we tried some different things out and built in more complexity. And like Brandon said, we ended up having sort of different rigs for different levels of detail, or a simplified rig if we knew we were going to be redrawing most of the body and we just kind of wanted to float the head on top, and like use deformers where we could, but if we knew we were going to need to redraw basically every frame, like a more frame by frame action shot where Monkey's spinning through the air or something, we would opt for a much simpler rig or no rig. But I think Burger could go into, I don't know if it's time for that, but if you want to go into like the most complicated version of what we ended up with.
Yeah, well, from episode to episode, I tried to talk with the leads and with the animators to find out to what they wanted, like the adjustments that they were making to the rigs, the things that they were constantly adding or changing, or things that just didn't work. So I think for every episode, there's a new monkey. There's, there's a new rig, and you're like, hey, everybody, here's the rig for the next episode, where it's got a lot of cleanups and a lot of patches and a lot of things to kind of hopefully make it easier to work with, and became more and more robust. And kind of to that end, let's see if we can. Jared was mentioning the master controllers on previous projects, and it would completely change and alter the style of the show if we had really fluid master controllers on this, where the head would tween and move around and stuff, especially because it would only really probably be on the main characters and nobody else, so it would look really odd. But I did try to incorporate some stuff in here to for quality of life issues for the animators, just pulling from the library and adding stuff so that you could quickly recall different approved faces and stuff as you were working, or you could get different angles. It's almost like just a pose generator at this point, but something just to kind of help quickly lay out a scene to make it where you can take some of the guesswork out. There's a few things that we added in with the point constraints to try and get some brow movements so that things can kind of work together to kind of simulate more of a realistic muscular structure here.
Oh, that's clever.
Especially with, as much as we've talked about how expressive Monkey needs to be, like he's got all of this, these muscles and stuff here to kind of really help him emote. So we kind of tried to push that to make it a little bit easier. And then different switches to kind of turn things on and off to make it easier to grab. If you're up in this view and you can't see his eyes, you can turn this off to work, and just different things that as we've gone through the animation process, talking to the animators and seeing what they like and what they don't like, trying to make those adjustments on the fly.
How many different views do you have of Monkey?
6, I believe. We because we have like the normal. I know we use different words at our studio, but we have a full 3/4, and then normally you would go to a pro, but we kind of have a cheated pro that kind of works as kind of like a facing to camera for acting purposes before the pro, and then like your OTS and a full OTS. And the body kind of does the same thing. The body doesn't have the master controllers because they never stay at all in any of the poses like this. It's not a walking, talking show. It's a lot of action. So they kind of stay limited to just the views to kind of start as a base. But the head specifically, we try to streamline it as much as possible.
Yeah, faces are important. So it's and they're the hardest to kind of get right many times. So we wanted to give as many preset sort of reference points to start from for animators.
Yeah, Brandon, one thing I wanted to ask was, did you have a chance to try anything new on the production that you haven't had an opportunity to do previously?
Yes. I'm trying to think the best way of kind of talk. There's some techniques that I've been wanting to try out for making shadows and controlling shadows to make it a little easier for animators, especially as they pass over. Having more control for art direction so that you can kind of control the color of the shadow as it passes over, as opposed to using like blend modules and different things to simulate like a Photoshop multiply. So there's some of that I've been able to incorporate in some of the characters. The constraints are new now, again, as kind of talking with the animation team to find out what kind of stuff they needed to kind of help with the expressiveness. So it's kind of that fine line between wanting to use all the fun toys but not make it so complicated that it's hard to deal with. So a lot of the stuff that I've been trying to implement is stuff that kind of runs behind the scenes that the animators don't have to necessarily deal with unless something breaks.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, it's tempting when you're rigging a character to want to put all these bells and whistles in, but if an animator doesn't know how to use it, then that won't get used.
Yeah, or it'll make the file really heavy, like with our action shots, especially if you've got 3, 4, 5 ninjas fighting monkey in a garden. Luckily, we did that the easiest way, but they bog down really quick whenever you start having a lot of heavy rigs jumping and flipping and doing stuff. So,
Kevin, did you have a chance to try anything new on this production?
I mean, it was my first time art directing a show, so that was incredibly new. But a lot of it was just learning a lot from these two and all the other people in our pipeline. A lot of what we were doing that was new was kind of stuff that we had wanted to try on other shows, more just from a directing standpoint, like just doing a more action based thing, getting out of some of the constraints that, you know, rightfully so, other shows have that are make their productions look a certain way, work a certain way, and really just experimenting with like, okay, how far can we push this? And I know this sounds so simple, but one of the things that we really kind of pushed for, and it's, you know, I think maybe every production struggles with this, but it's just like getting everybody on board with and talking about just like, okay, we want to see full body like walk cycles in a couple shots, like making sure it looks good on the background, making sure that the characters look right, you know, walking, especially Monkey, since he does walk differently, and just really kind of having those conversations, and talking with, you know, a lot of working with design about making sure that animation had all the stuff that they needed, talking animation to get, you know, everybody else on board with that. You know, and I know that sounds kind of a vague non-answer, but it really, because all of it was a little bit new, all of it was both fun and problem solving. So starting a show from scratch means nobody has the answer. So.
And Jared, was there anything on this production that was you had a chance to do something new in terms of your role?
Yeah, I feel like everything was new. I think previous productions I'd worked on, I really didn't get to pull as many of my own kind of like references and sensibilities as I got to on this show. I definitely like my animation heroes are like mostly Japanese and French. So, you know, previously I'd worked on a lot of productions where it was really more of a Western animation. The guiding light was more, you know, based in variety of American television and feature animation. And on this, you know, the creators came to us like wanting us to reference the stuff that I like. So that was maybe like the starting point for all of the fun new things we got to do. For me, at least, was like, okay, cool, I get to like reference Masaki Uasa here, like, and not have to explain, like, not have to like sell somebody on it and be like, yeah, can we like, you know, not look at like Disney animation for a second? Everyone
I can
was
second all that. Like that was nice.
everyone was already on board with it, so it was like great.
One of the fun things working with these two, and especially, you know, working with Jared on his team, was seeing the excitement in people when they got to like, oh, you mean I can rough this out and I can carry it through? Like that was one of the conversations that Jared and I had a lot, was like his people taking shots from start to finish, those, you know, and that was a good thing. Like they could rough it out, they could sit there and tween it, and they could take it to the end until it delivers to comp almost, and that was exciting to see.
Kevin, on your end, what sort of opportunities did Hitmonkey create for you to try things that were new to this production they didn't do in previous productions?
The widescreen thing was a huge game changer, because so much stuff is done in that 16:9 aspect ratio, and I'm a big fan of it in certain instances, but for whatever reason, I'm a big nerd for those black bars on the top and bottom of the screen. So a lot of that was just really getting a chance to break loose myself, and also the boards team, the backgrounds team, everybody, on how we compose shots and how we compose sequences within that quote unquote limited frame. It allows for a much wider scope of view, but like animation doesn't do it a lot, at least not Western animation. So for me, it was just getting that visual cue in there that lets people know this is a different thing than what you're used to seeing. Like this isn't, this has a different viewpoint on it. And I think that was important. Like that was important to have those discussions with with the supervising director and the producers and the show creators and stuff like that. But then also figuring out what our own language for that was, and then working with all the background painters, the 3D department, and all that, and just finding ways to streamline the production while still getting this insanely high value out of it. Because much to our producers' chagrin, it's a very high shot count show, much to the animator's chagrin as well. So it really was like figuring out ways to streamline things and get the most value out of, can someone paint this in an hour or two, or does it need a full day? Does it need a couple days? Is it a big beauty shot? Stuff like that. And really looking at, each thing as like, okay, what value does it add if we spend more time, or does the shot go by fast, and then especially working with the designers and working with the, working on that stuff, it's like, okay, putting really thought into the character. Okay, this is, whether it's a drone or whatever, one of the big directions from the creators was just getting more interesting looking people, everybody should feel like an actor that was cast intentionally, and that's something that we still try to carry through, on other stuff that we do. But it really was kind of an eye-opening moment, like working with them, and especially working with design, and then talking to Jared about like animation and stuff like that. Was like, he mentioned earlier giving people slight ticks and stuff like that. That was stuff that came from the top down, and something that we really embraced, and really was something different than anything else that we had done previously, I feel like.
Gavin, do you have any advice for artists who are interested in working at a studio like Floyd County?
Yeah, go for pay attention to the people like these sessions here, go find the people that you like that are saying the things that you want to hear more of, and follow them on social media and see what they're talking about, see what they're reacting to. And because a lot of times they're posting job openings. As someone who does a lot of hiring, the biggest thing that I see is, the two biggest things that I see over and over is somebody will just apply for every job. So then you don't know what they want to do. And then the other thing is you'll get someone who applies for a job, but they don't have anything related to that in their portfolio. And it's like, okay, did you just apply to the, so that's, and I know that seems very kind of like, vague, but it's go for the thing that you want, figure out what you want, go for that thing, and don't take, it's not rejection. It's not right now, like you may not be ready now. The production may not require your set of skills, that sort of thing. If you're an action person, I don't know that applying to a, proscenium style show is going to be your gig. You might not do well at that. So try to gauge who you are, where you're at, and where you want to be, and aim at those things, and just make sure that your portfolio, or at least what you're sharing with people, reflects current, up to date. And then when you come back to those people in 3 to 6 months, make sure that portfolio is not what you sent them before, because they're going to look at, I get that so much too. If there's a third thing, I get that a lot, where it's like, review a portfolio, see them again 6 months later. It's the same portfolio, just in a different order. That does nobody no favors, and I see it way too often. I wish it was just one time, but I see it a lot. So
my memory's not that bad.
Well, here's the thing: is my memory's bad when it comes to faces and names, but I remember your art.
I remember your portfolio.
It starts just like being like, this is familiar. Why is this familiar?
You changed the song, and you didn't even re-edit the reel.
Yeah. So. And I'm sure the other two, I see both head nods. I'm sure the other two have things that they can tack onto that. But that's, again, I think it's important to know who you are, if not for if only just for that moment of, what do I want to do for the next 6 months? What am I gearing my efforts towards? You know what I mean? And it's like, okay, drill into that thing and seek out like-minded people that are both struggling to find jobs, but also that seem like you gel with in the industry, and then you don't need to berate them with questions, just follow them and see what they're talking about, see what they're doing, and then that will give you insight.
Everything is so constantly changing that staying up with what people are interested in is vastly more like helpful than trying to ask a bunch of questions that may not really
Mm.
answer anything that is helpful.
Yeah, no, I love this. I've been talking to a ton of students this year, so this is,
Yeah.
you know, really what I've been trying to share with people. It's like,
I
especially
think-
if they're young, it's like you think you need to be versatile and you think you need to like meet certain requirements, but really, the best thing you can do is follow your own interests, and because that's what you're going to be good at. It's like whatever you're most excited about, and then find a production that needs you, because there is one out there. And the fact, it's not even just that you're enthusiastic, it's that like when I see someone's work, I can tell they really love doing what they're doing.
And the same thing comes through on tests. Like if we opt to test someone, we can tell whether or not they cared about it, whether or not, you know, whether or not the test was something they were into, and that leads a lot into whether or not we carry things further. You know, and it's not to say that you shouldn't generalize, but just it makes it hard when on the hiring side of things, when you're trying to fill a specific role and you don't know if that person is, you know, if that's what they're really passionate about, because you need someone that passion is going to carry them through 6 to 12 months of, you know.
Yeah, I would also say, you know, like if you want to be in animation, you want to essentially be a filmmaker or be part of the process of filmmaking. And so find whatever aspect of filmmaking that gets you excited, and then find those artists out there doing that. Not just like Kevin's talking about, where it's like find these specific people, but rather find these artists who like inspire you and try to rip them off. And I think more often than not, you're going to come out with something that looks nothing like what they're doing, and it's going to be you. People are so afraid to do. Young people are afraid to rip.
My art does not look like my influences, and I tell that people all the time. It's like the stuff I love, I do not draw like that at all. But
yeah,
you know, like, that's...
I can't even tell if I have no idea. It's like looking at your own face. You're like, what does this look like? I don't know.
So we have just over 3 minutes left. So I just want to quickly go through. Brandon, where can viewers follow you on the web and see more of your work?
I think the easiest place would be my website, just brandonleeberger.com. I've got a few social media things that are all kind of linked there, but I post most stuff there.
Kevin, same question. Where can we find you?
KevinMellon.com, 2 L's, and then @KMellon on Twitter and Instagram.
And Jared, where can people find your work?
I'm @Thickman on Instagram, ThickMin.
All right. Well, first, congratulations on the announcement of season 2 of Hitmonkey. Really excited to see the renewal. And I want to thank you, all three of you, for your time discussing your work on the show. And thank you to our audience for joining us for this panel at the Animation Trends event. If you enjoyed this panel, be sure to register for Thursday's sessions. Lindsay Noller will be demoing a remarkably versatile arm rig in Harmony Premium, and I'll be interviewing Mark Simon about his storyboarding process on Stranger Things. You won't want to miss it, so be sure to tune in tomorrow. Thank you.
Got that read in.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.